Good afternoon, friends. It's 3 p.m. and I take this opportunity as the Director General of the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analyses. My name is Sujan Chinoy. I take this opportunity to extend a very warm welcome to all of you for the K Subrahmanyam Memorial Lecture. I particularly wish to welcome to this event Dr. S. Jaishankar, the Minister of External Affairs of India, and Dr. C. Raja Mohan, our keynote speaker, who will deliver today the K Subrahmanyam Memorial Lecture. Friends, today we have gathered to mark the 10th anniversary of the passing of Sri K Subrahmanyam, which to be precise fell on the 2nd of February this year. Sri K Subrahmanyam, as you all know, was a remarkable person. He was a civil servant, policy practitioner, intelligence analyst, strategic thinker, a prolific media commentator, and above all, political advisor to many. He stood for robust national security structures and postures. He was one of the first to back the notion of guns and butter as against guns versus butter. Today's lecture will be delivered by Dr. C. Raja Mohan, who is very well known as one of India's finest strategic thinkers, as one who cut his teeth as a young scholar at IDSA and as a protege of Sri K Subrahmanyam. I think there is no better person than he to speak on the topic of when to intervene using force beyond borders. This is not an easy question. The spectrum for intervention ranges from surgical strikes against terrorist infrastructure to involvement in ethnic conflicts or coming to the aid of friendly governments. Our own action in J&K in 1947-1948, in Hyderabad, in Div, Daman and Goa do not fall in that category, each of these being a sovereign part of Indian territory. Friends, as you all know, Sri K Subrahmanyam was one of the moving spirits in the founding of the Institute for Defence Studies and Analyses in 1965 and became its second director in 1968, serving up to 1975. In the aftermath of our war with China in 1962 and the conflict with Pakistan in 1965, Sri Subrahmanyam was an early advocate of defense reforms. The nuclear option, improved intelligence inputs, and dexterous engagement of great powers. His advocacy of the nuclear deal with the US stands out. His first term at IDSA coincided with a world as much in flux as the one we live in today. Sino-Soviet relations had deteriorated dramatically in the late 1960s. President Nixon, upon assuming office, was straightaway grappling with the question of an honorable retreat from Vietnam. US intervention in Vietnam is a big example of the use of force beyond borders, like the Russian intervention in Afghanistan and US interventions post 9/11 in Afghanistan and in Iraq. More relevant from our point of view, Sri K Subrahmanyam presided over IDSA as director at a time when the subcontinent was going through the birth pangs of Bangladesh, midwifed by India. I recall seeing an incisive policy paper prepared at the IDSA, which he forwarded to the then Secretary to the Prime Minister, Sri P.N. Haksar, and many others on the 4th of April, 1971. It was titled Bangladesh Policy Options for India. Now, weighing the pros and cons in India's national interests, he had advocated early intervention in East Pakistan. The rest, as we all know, is history. It is rare, but Sri K Subrahmanyam once again was the director of IDSA for another 7 years, from 1980 to 1987. A key challenge in the subcontinent then was the internal conflict in Sri Lanka, which eventually led to the Colombo Accord of 1987, under which India deployed the IPKF from 1987 to 1990. As you all know, the Honorable Minister himself was stationed in Sri Lanka in those days. Around this time, India faced another tough choice in its neighborhood in the Maldives, where it conducted Operation Cactus. It involved the use of force beyond borders in support of the country's legitimate government, which had sought India's assistance in dealing with a grave national security threat. Today, I can say with confidence that India has consolidated its image as a key stakeholder in the evolving security architecture in the Indian Ocean region. And Dr. Jaishankar's recent visits to Mauritius and to the Maldives have only added ballast to this outlook that these countries have towards India. Sri Subrahmanyam's contributions to the draft nuclear security doctrine of India and his chairmanship of the Kargil Review Committee are legendary and have continued to guide the national security discourse. In his prescient pronouncements, it is clear that Sri Subrahmanyam had long anticipated the disruption that would be caused by China's rise as an economic and military power, and perhaps its unilateralism as well. For his take on all this and more, we now turn to our distinguished speaker, Dr. C. Raja Mohan. I request him to deliver his lecture over the next 35 minutes or so, after which we shall have a Q&A session. At the end of it, we are privileged to have the vote of thanks delivered by none other than India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, himself a chip of the old block, if I may be permitted to use that term. He, with good reason, reminds us most of Sri Subrahmanyam's sharp intellectual reflexes in dealing with India's current geostrategic challenges. Thank you all. And before I request the keynote speaker to take the floor, may I request you all to kindly mute your mics, and also during the Q&A session to kindly pose your questions very briefly in the Q&A box and not the chat box. With this, I now turn to Dr. C. Raja Mohan. Dr. Raja Mohan, the floor is yours.
IDSA, Dr. Jaishankar, External Affairs Minister, distinguished members of the audience, friends, it's always a special occasion for me to be part of the IDSA events. As a student of JNU doing my MPhil and PhD, I did most of my research over long years at the small but fabulous library of the IDSA in the 1970s, when it was located in the Sapru House. I then had the opportunity to work at IDSA for nearly a decade under Mr. Subrahmanyam for most of the part, till the early 1990s, and enjoyed my association with IDSA activity since then. But today is very special. It's a great honor for me to deliver a lecture in memory of Mr. K Subrahmanyam. I'd like to thank Ambassador Chinoy for giving me this privilege. Case was an inspiration and a mentor to many students of strategy and international relations from my generation. I had the privilege of working with him when he was the director of IDSA in the 1980s. And I benefited from a continuous engagement with him until his death 10 years ago. K showered unstinting generosity on anyone, whether Indian, foreigner, old or young, who was interested in the issues of strategy, Indian, regional or international. When we invited him to speak at JNU in the famous post-dinner symposiums, which used to be a great fixture in JNU, he was happy to drive on his own all the way from India Gate to JNU hostels, engage in vigorous argument with all those who challenged him from the student community. His commitment to educating the public on strategic issues, widening the public square for the discourse on foreign and security policies, his willingness to share knowledge with other students of strategy, and above all, his enthusiasm to mentor the rise of new scholars were very, very distinguishing features of his persona. K's contributions in shaping the Indian strategic discourse are many. The debate on nuclear weapons, the generation of awareness on the Indian Ocean in a sea-blind political elite, modernizing India's military education, promoting security sector reforms, or some of them. In influencing the Indian public discourse, Case became the principal voice that explained the world to India and India to the world. At a time when our nation, moved itself into relative isolation in the 1970s and 1980s. Unsurprisingly, his presence in IDSA drew anyone interested in India and its role in the world on a daily basis to Sapru House, both journalists from India, internationally, foreign visitors. IDSA was a major destination. As a young employee of the IDSA, it was great to be part of a remarkable intellectual salon that our rather cramped quarters at Sapru House had become under Mr. Subrahmanyam. One of K.'s main contributions, I believe, was to rescue the Indian strategic debate from ideological grip of the 1960s and 70s. He injected a measure of hard realism and pragmatism into India's discourse on international affairs. While he was generous to a fault, I mean, he had little patience of a woolly-headed thinking on what India's security meant. His willingness to question publicly the dominant narratives on the left and the right made him at once a controversial and probably the most stimulating thinker of his generation on Indian strategy. KS was also a champion of reform and innovation in India's national security policies at a time when the comfort of status quo was enveloping the Indian system. Of course, his willingness to challenge conventional wisdom occasionally got him into trouble with the bureaucracy, but it gave KS the power to shape policy more than any single servant or minister over the last many decades that I know of. That his influence on the way India thought about itself and the world are profoundly changed over the period thanks to his intellectual contributions. In his final 2 decades, in the 90s and 2000s, KS was very enthused about India's prospects to emerge as a great power. He began to articulate new frameworks for Delhi to prepare for this larger role in world affairs. He demanded a comprehensive rethinking of the assumptions that guided India's security thinking in the second half of the 20th century. As India now takes its place in the front ranks of nations, I think it is our duty to carry forward that task amidst the nation's altered international status, as well as the changing nature of our interests. A rising India with expanding interests must inevitably confront questions about the use of force, especially beyond our borders. We've seen the present government to transcend some of the familiar taboos that shaped Indian thinking on the use of force in the past. That makes, I think, the task of think tanks and academia very, very important and exciting at this point of time. When KS dominated the Indian discourse on international affairs, the strategic community was rather small. KS was eager to expand that community, bring scholars, soldiers, and bureaucrats together to debate issues of foreign and national security policies. We will certainly be thrilled today to look at the dramatic expansion of think tanks and platforms in recent years. This proliferation reflects, of course, the growing popular interest in security issues, as well as the widening circle of stakeholders. But you might also want to know why the think tanks have become so conformist. Even a cursory survey of India's recent foreign policy discourse reveals that it is the governments that have often come up with new ideas rather than the think tanks. Worse still, the think tanks have tended to caution against change rather than advocate policy innovation. If there's one thing that stands out in KS's approach, it was a need to continuously debate the wider set of options for India's national security. It is in that spirit that I'll touch upon some of the issues on questions of use of force and intervention. As someone who's never been part of a government, so give me the liberty to be irreverent or probably question some of the familiar assumptions about what India was or what India ought to be. My lecture focuses on an important theme that Ambassador Sujan Chinoy already referred to, the liberation of Bangladesh. 5 decades ago this year, of course today, 5 decades ago this year, it was a central issue facing India about the role of India and its options in liberating Bangladesh. The choice that India had to make in 1971 was not an easy one. It raised multiple questions about legitimacy, feasibility, consequences, and costs that India might incur in the event of actually intervening. But KS's forceful articulation of the historic moment that confronted India eventually carried the day. My objective is not to get into the specifics of that particular intervention, but rather look at the enduring questions about the use of force that continue to challenge India and its policymakers. We all know that the use of force is central to statecraft. Ensuring the monopoly over violence within one's own territory is the very essence of sovereignty. It's also critical to build a nation within that sovereign space. Use of force beyond one's borders is more complicated. It's frowned by all nation states, but it remains the permanent feature of international relations. The nature and modalities of the use of force may have changed, but use of force and intervention will remain with us until there is a credible collective security system, well, no policymaker today in any chancellery can bet that is around the corner. But to be sure, in the aftermath of the Cold War, it seemed that the conditions did exist for a different order, but that phase is now well behind us. The proposition that one hyperpower can produce order on its own across the globe had its moment, but that moment has clearly passed. Renewed great power competition has begun to overshadow the preoccupation of the last 2 decades with a war against terrorism. The great power competition will inevitably envelop others in the international system. Both interstate and interventionary wars are now back on the agenda, and we all have to deal with it. The rise of new great powers, the growing military capabilities of regional powers, too, have increased the prospects for the use of force. Therefore, Indian security policymakers will have to inevitably address the questions of use of force. And these questions are about the principles, purposes, and strategies that must guide India's own approach to use of force. This is not an easy subject, as Ambassador Chinoy pointed out, but KS would certainly have approved my wading, if responsibly, into this sensitive subject. At his Ramnath Goenka Memorial Lecture last year, Minister Jaishankar too talked about the need for an honest introspection into our past and drawing the appropriate lessons from it. The government itself has begun to highlight elements of Indian military history that were deliberately neglected in the past by the Indian political class. Prime Minister Modi has pulled India out of its collective amnesia on the Indian Army's participation in the First and Second World Wars. The PM has drawn frequent attention to the provisional governments of India. This is, we're talking about before 1947. Those were set up. The first was set up in Kabul in 1915, and the second in Singapore in 1943 by Subhash Bose. Both these provisional governments were about important sections of the national movement believing that violent means were necessary to oust the British imperial power from India. That's not the dominant narrative, but we must not forget there were other narratives of how to achieve Indian independence. While strategic communities elsewhere in the world have dug deep into India's military past, for example, the Afghan wars, India's Afghan wars, anyone who's gone to the India Gate will see part of the India Gate's memorial is to India's Afghan wars. Independent India Security Studies Scholarship pretends there was no past before 1947. Similarly, anyone interested in the conflicts in northern Burma today would want to study the Anglo-Burmese wars. Put simply, a closer study of India's military experience in the pre-independence era might offer us a deep historical perspective and valuable insights into the use of force. Our scholarship has also been hesitant to explore the tension between the ideas and practice of independent India. India's emphasis on nonviolence, peaceful resolution of disputes, and the ambition to construct an area of peace are rightly celebrated. But we rarely look into the tests that came in, the integration of the princely states, the first war in Kashmir in 1947-48, the PLA's entry into Tibet. These consequential developments did not, however, unfortunately, make sufficient dent into the dominant narrative about India's policy imperatives on peace and security. One important part of that narrative is what brings me to the topic of today, is the presumed centrality of the principle of non-intervention in India's foreign policy. This formulation that somehow India stands for non-intervention tends to conflate or mistake independent India's determination, correctly, to prevent other powers from intervening in its own internal affairs. That is very different from the question of India's intervention beyond its borders. So I think these two, often it's easy to conflate these two, but I think we need to clearly separate these two aspects. And this is not a kind of hypocrisy on the part of India. Much of the world does the same. The dual approach to sovereignty and intervention. All large nations, especially major powers, adopt a similar approach. Going beyond that, the stronger the power, the greater the temptation to affirm not only non-intervention in its own domestic affairs, but also prevent other powers from interfering on its periphery and to challenge its regional primacy. The Monroe Doctrine of the United States, the Russian conception of the near abroad, and China's current effort to push America out of the Western Pacific are part of the same tradition. The strategic objective of regional dominance is often couched in more appealing ideological slogans, such as Pan-Americanism, Eurasianism, Pan-Asianism. In our own region, we know that the Asia for Asians idea was used by Imperial Japan in the 1930s, and now is being resurrected by Xi's China. Despite the rich nuances associated with non-intervention, the Indian discourse often sought to frame it in very idealist terms. Consider, for example, the sacralization, the elevation of the Panchshri, or the five principle coexistence, into something divine. Contrary to the popular perception, it was not Jawaharlal Nehru, but the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai who took the initiative on drafting Panchshri. During his visit to India in 1954, Zhou Enlai insisted on putting Panchshri into a fairly mundane agreement on trade and commerce between Tibet region of China and India. Nehru went along. Zhou Enlai had good reason to insist on non-intervention. It's that objective of China that we've failed to analyze or debate. But it was not about non-intervention in absolute terms. It was about China demanding an end to India's special relationship with Tibet that preceded the communist China's dominance over Tibet. Over the decades, however, the notion of Panchshri was abstracted out of its historic context and given an ideological weight all of its own. But those who see Panchshri as part of a complex and unfortunate evolution of Sino-Indian relations have no reason to offer eulogies for that piece of paper. Tragic as it has been, Panchshri has been followed more in breach than in observance. Delhi was deeply riled by China's support to insurgencies. And we've seen most recently in the wake of the changes in Kashmir on the Indian constitution, China's quick move to contest that. And so therefore, I think we got to be clear here. A soaring rhetoric on grandiose themes cannot hide the deeply contested territoriality of India and China that continues to hobble our relationship. The Indian discourse often frames the use of force and intervention either along the north-south axis or the east-west axis. In the north-south narrative, the former colonial powers of the north routinely resort to use of force and intervention, and the developing countries of the south are merely victims of these interventions. The former is certainly true, but the latter is accurate only in part. The fact is, developing countries are as much prone to intervention in the internal affairs of their neighbors. For contestation of power among the southern states has endured, notwithstanding the rhetoric of the common interests of the global south. The struggles to build nation states, the reality of artificial boundaries imposed by the departing powers, the problem of equitable access to economic resources, uneven development, ethnic and religious divides contribute to immense internal conflict and often draw neighbors into it. Those of you who might have chance to look at strategic analysis of the 1980s, KS goes continuously into this problem of how this was an important shift in the international relations, that the internal conflict seemed to replace the great power conflict. And I think we're still struggling with some of those challenges that come from the turbulence within the developing world. It's no surprise that intervention by developing states is very common today. Now, anyone who looks at the contemporary Middle East can see the extent of regional rivalries and military intervention by almost all the major regional actors in that part of the world. But there was also a tendency during the Cold War for many countries of the South to treat interventions by the West and the East in different ways. It's not as shocking as it might appear to be. During the Cold War, India tended to criticize Western interventions, but somewhat ambivalent about Soviet interventions. This ambivalence came into sharp focus in the manner in which India dealt with the Anglo-French intervention in the Suez, the Soviet interventions in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and later Afghanistan in 1979. This is not surprising because the nationalist movements struggle against Western powers and the growing perception in a large part of the developing world that the Soviet Union was a natural ally of the non-aligned world. The tendency to set different standards for one's friends and adversaries is not unique to India. After all, there is a question of national interest. While Delhi privately urged the Soviet Union in the early 80s to end the war in Afghanistan, Delhi was unwilling to join the West and condemn Soviet intervention in public. After all, for Moscow was India's main strategic partner through the Cold War. It was a major source of arms, and it continued to block Anglo-American meddling in Kashmir at the UN Security Council. India's position on the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, of course, had its cause in the West and in the Islamic world. There have been occasions, of course, where India gave support to interventions by its friends more explicitly. Recall the Indian backing in the late 1970s for the Vietnamese intervention in Cambodia and alienating the ASEAN at that point of time. It is indeed true that supporting Vietnamese intervention was right from the perspective of moral politics, but it also involved some real politics of helping Vietnam stand up against China at that point of time. It's not that the great powers take an objective view of interventions. Both the Eastern and the Western powers denounce the use of force by the other as evil, but see their own interventions as principled. But the West was somewhat better at justifying its interventions in terms of international law and using international institutions, including the dominant media, to control the narrative. Ironically, that was not always enough to sustain domestic political support. This is very important. Whatever might be in the external legitimation, the domestic support for the US interventions could not be sustained, whether it was Vietnam or more recently in Afghanistan and Iraq. Prolonged use of force abroad generates serious domestic costs and turns the domestic opinion against it. We are not unfamiliar with it. We faced that similar situation in our intervention in Sri Lanka. In the 1990s, in the aftermath of the Cold War, the Western tendency to intervene acquired a new intensity, thanks to the disappearance of the Soviet Union and the fact that China had not yet risen, seemed to provide a free run for the US in the UN Security Council. And the West seemed to make light of the notion of territorial sovereignty, and they imagined the UNSC as some kind of a supranational directorate that was free to make political judgments about the internal situation of other countries and endorse military interventions. There was strong resistance to these ideas in many countries, including India, that had to urgently fend off international attempts to meddle in Kashmir. The Western academia and human rights organizations trashed territorial sovereignty as an outdated concept and justified the new interventionism in the name of universal ideals. There was widespread condescension at the Indian and Chinese attachment to sovereignty. Some people called it the East failure. Some even urged Delhi and Beijing to abandon notions of sovereignty and accept interventions as part of life. In an ironic twist, many of the same advocates of abandoning sovereignty are now having trouble coping with a newly risen China that has begun to flex its muscle and actively intervene in the internal affairs of other nations. So be careful what you wish for. And China has demonstrated sophisticated ways of intervention to influence operations, the so-called sharp power, to turn the politics of other societies, including the most advanced Western nations, in its favor. And resistance to this new trend is proving rather hard given the strength of China's sharp power. China's approach to interventions is not a simple one. It had supported revolutionary movements across Asia in the 1960s and the early 70s during the Cultural Revolution. It was in the era of reform and opening up, it tempered the tendency to intervene. But once it has risen today, it has returned to the logic of a great power, which has great global interests, and therefore it is willing to use force to defend those interests. And I think that's a new reality. Much of Asia is barely coming to terms with it. India, of course, has its own complex tradition on interventions, sending troops into East Pakistan to liberate Bangladesh and keeping peace in Sri Lanka were among the most notable India's interventions. There were other cases too, like the liberation of Goa. Liberation of Goa, I mean, as Ambassador Chinoy said, look, it's justified from India's nationalist point of view, but Goa was still a territory of Portugal, whether we liked it or not, in terms of international law. And dealing with that required a lot of skill. And I think India faced a lot of international flack at that time. India also gave support to the Burmese government against rebels advancing on the capital in 1949. It supported Colombo in defeating the JVP insurrection in 1971. We celebrate some of these interventions. We ignore those that are uncomfortable. But as students of national security and strategy, we owe ourselves to dig deep into each of these instances of India's use of force beyond borders. While armed forces do make assessments of all their operations, the students of international relations and strategic studies, we've not done our job in assessing the political and security calculus that went into these interventions, the debate between competing perspectives in the decision making, the international reaction to these interventions, the immediate outcomes, and the long-term consequences, both intended and unintended. Learning from our own past on the use of force is critical for insights into when, where, and how to use force. For our assumption that the imperatives of intervention will continue to grow with the rise of India in the international system, the imperative also arises from globalization of the Indian economy and the growing impact of the external world on India's peace and prosperity. For example, if India is importing a critical raw material from one corner of the world and there is a military coup, would India want to simply make a phone call to the Secretary General, or should it have the capacity to do something about the transformation that has taken place in a place where India has significant interests? It is a question that we do not often debate, but I think it's important to note that India does not shape its environment. We'll have to live by the rules that others are going to set for us because nature abhors vacuum. The wider scope of India's rising national interests does not, of course, take away from the continuing primacy of territorial defense. This is obvious, given the continuing threats we face both on our northern and our western borders. But how we address those challenges might be beginning to change. In the past, we were weighted down by the Panipat syndrome, if you will. The Panipat syndrome condemned India to passive and reactive defense on its own doorstep when the threat actually materialized. We are now seeing the birth of an active strategy that wants to go beyond borders to attack the very source of the threat. National Security Advisor Ajit Doval has expanded on this approach of active defense last October in his remarks at Rishikesh. As we mark the second anniversary of Balakot attack, which is tomorrow, by the Indian Air Force, it's important for security studies scholars to examine the intricacies of an active defense strategy that takes the battle to the enemy. This must include a focus on the kind of capabilities and strategies we need to make a success of a new approach to territorial defense that is not limited to the boundary, but goes beyond that. Even as we rethink our approaches to territorial defense, India's regional security role has drawn widespread attention. If there's one phrase that captures this new trend, it is the notion of India as a net security provider. Those of you who are interested in this, IDSA had produced a report a few years ago. I would certainly recommend all of you to look at that report as well as its focus on out-of-area operations that IDSA produced. It was first of that kind of report. The phrase might be new, but India's regional security role in the subcontinent is not. India's military interventions and regional security diplomacy are very much part of the tradition. An important question today is about the potential for an expansion of India's security role beyond South Asia to encompass the Indian Ocean and more broadly the Indo-Pacific. So far, our interventions have largely been limited to South Asia, but as India's weight and interest grow, the question of a wider region and the use of force there are going to inevitably come up. Although India has long claimed the Indian Ocean as its security sphere, it's only in the last few years that we've seen a more purposeful military diplomacy to buttress that claim. When Great Britain announced the withdrawal of forces from east of Suez in 1968, the only time India had a real debate on Indian Ocean, the conclusion was that India must reject the notion of power vacuum, renounce any interest in playing a larger security role, and turn to multilateral solutions. We go to the UN, we call for declaring Indian Ocean as a zone of peace. That was our answer. But today, there is a new Indian determination to shape the geopolitics of the Indian Ocean. And that is codified in the 2015 speech in Mauritius by Prime Minister Modi. It is probably the first speech by an Indian Prime Minister on our imperatives in the Indian Ocean. It's quite amazing. In the 70 years, we just had one policy speech on the Indian Ocean. So much for Delhi's suffocating continentalism that has limited us from looking at our maritime territories. But India's maritime strategy is clearly work in progress. It needs much scholarship and analysis to look at the various possibilities and limitations of a larger regional security role in the Indo-Pacific. Long before India considered a wider regional role, independent India found a way to contribute to international peace and security through the UN-mandated peacekeeping operations. Amidst the superpower standoff in the Cold War, there were a few spaces where non-aligned and neutral powers like India could chip in. And India had vast military resources. Together, these factors made India the largest contributor to international peacekeeping operations over the last 5 decades. While we celebrate this record, it's time for us to ask some important questions of the government. Should India continue to stay with the old framework, even as the nature of peacekeeping has changed and India's own position in the international system has evolved? Is India's use of force going to be dependent on what the P5 say? Is the objective of peacekeeping only about buttressing India's campaign for a permanent seat in the UNSC? Or does it have a military purpose of its own? Is there a strategy beyond the UN Security Council campaign? In this context, I think it is worth taking a look at China's growing role in peacekeeping operations. China broke from the unwritten rule that the P5 members would not take part in peacekeeping operations. As Beijing became an active participant in peace operations in the last few years, I see one important strategic motivation. It is the need to overcome PLA's lack of operational experience beyond its borders. China is using PKOs today to expand its military weight and influence in many parts of the world, especially in Africa. That brings me to another important dimension of interventions. Legitimacy, political legitimacy, is an intangible but important dimension of military interventions. For democracies, domestic legitimacy is as important as external legitimacy. Even a just use of force could be seen as illegitimate if the narrative around the conflict is not clearly set and communicated to the audience at home and abroad. The question of legitimacy has dogged many recent US interventions. In many cases, the criterion for the legitimacy is seen as the approval of the UNSC. But is the UNSC the arbiter of ultimate morality? Can the US UNSC, which is really an agreement among the 5 powers, get it right all the time? India did not have much support in the UNSC or the UNGA for its use of force to liberate Bangladesh. We should never forget that. Does that make it illegitimate? What matters in the end, I mean, from a purely realist perspective, is how successful you are with your military operation. If a military can quickly and decisively create new and sustainable facts on the ground, much of the international system will be ready to deal with the new dynamic. But the question of international political support and domestic political support remains the same. So therefore, effectiveness, success, and legitimacy all must be factored in considering interventions. In debating the questions of success and effectiveness, our strategic community must study Indian Army's own use of force beyond borders in the pre- and post-independence eras. It's also useful to turn to the US debates. After all, the US has been the most frequent intervener in the post-war world. After the failure in Vietnam, US armed forces came up with a doctrine going by the name of General Colin Powell on the preconditions for successful use of force. Powell decreed that the intervener needs a clearly defined political objective. It must avoid mission creep, that is, expand the goals through the conflict, use overwhelming force, and to achieve decisive results, and avoid a prolonged, costly intervention. On the face of it, these metrics were used for a successful intervention in liberating Kuwait from Saddam Hussein in 1990. But those lessons were quickly forgotten by the first term of George W. Bush between 2001 and 2003, when we saw the US begin disastrous interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. Ironically, General Powell was the Secretary of State in the first term of George W. Bush. So it's one thing, therefore, to come up with doctrines, and it's entirely another to ensure the internalization by the political class and the national security establishment of the rules of the road for use of force beyond one's borders. On the territorial defense and interventions in the immediate neighborhood, India has rightly chosen to set its own terms. That is, in the neighborhood, we are a lone ranger. We act on our own. We don't seek the UN permission, but we do things from what we see as fit. But on the global peacekeeping issue, we took a diametrically opposite approach, that we go by what the UN P5 decide and how the UN bureaucracy sets the mandate. And in recent years, of course, we tried to set up a trade union of the peacekeeping force contributing countries, but that doesn't escape the fact that we don't set the terms for peacekeeping operations. This issue did not generate controversy because these were distant theaters. But today, as India confronts wider security responsibilities, it is inevitable that the question of coalition operations presents themselves. Are you going to be a lone ranger? Are you going to work with others? Coalition operations have become important because there's no great power can today shape outcomes in a large theater like the Indo-Pacific. That in turn raises the question, who in the coalition sets the terms of engagement? What are the political objectives that must be pursued in a coalition operation? These issues might be relatively easy to address in non-strategic operations like humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. But the more strategic the mission becomes, the tougher are the questions of joint operations. But there's a question that India must begin to debate and debate seriously. And think tanks like IDSA should not be waiting for the political class to decide this. But we must begin to debate the issues involved in coalition operations. Even as we debate traditional forms of use of force and intervention, new challenges are emerging. Yesterday, those of you who heard the Army Chief, he talked about the cyberspace, the need for multi-domain operations, the emergence of non-kinetic but consequential warfare that is as damaging as modern warfare. The contestation involves not only states, but also non-state actors of all kinds. The capacity of non-state actors today to leverage cyberspace to trigger serious trouble and their ability to act as proxies for rival states have created sweeping new threats. In coping credibly and sustainably with the weaponization of social media and the non-state actors for strategic purposes, we democratic states need to upgrade their technical skills, enhance the strength of the political institutions, and generate, at least within the strategic communities, of a consensus on what kind of approaches we need to develop. Attacking behind the lines, destabilizing the home terrain of the adversary have always been important parts of warfare. Whether it's Sun Tzu or Kautilya, all talk about the importance of undermining the enemy's capacity to act. It has now got a big boost with new digital tools, and we in the democracies must be good at both defense and offense in this new domain in dealing with the new forms of warfare. So as I come to the conclusion, I think the question is we need to debate seriously on when, where, and how to use force beyond borders, because the issues that these raise are going to be with us for a long time. My objective today was to merely highlight some of the issues involved. It's really up to the current generation of scholars, those of you in IDSA and other think tanks in Delhi, and strategic analysts in India, and the growing community of strategic analysts in India, to delve deeper into the emerging challenges and the potential means to address them. Recalling the role and contributions of KS does not reveal what the answers to those questions are. But recalling his contributions certainly tells us how we might go about finding the answers to these difficult challenges that confront India's security. Thank you, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. C. Raja Mohan, for what has been truly a very thoughtful lecture. And also thank you for reminding us that in a flatter world such as the one that exists today, in which power is increasingly fractured, there are many countries that have the luxury of this use of force beyond borders and are able to intervene, developing countries included. And we have demonstrated that ourselves. Vietnam has also demonstrated that. I hope you can also cover in the Q&A session a couple of additional points. One is that this new brave new world in which we find ourselves has also given us other insidious ways of using force beyond borders. And one is, for instance, cyberspace, which has permitted cyber attacks beyond borders with a great degree of anonymity. The other is the subtle use of ideology information and propaganda, which has also been seen as a grave threat by many nations, misuse particularly of social media. And above all, terrorism beyond borders is also a tool. And Pakistan has amply demonstrated different versions, whether in Afghanistan or in India. So I hope you can reflect on that. And thank you for bringing out the fact that India has robustly reconciled its origins in tenets of peace and non-violence seamlessly with its ability to use force judiciously as and when required. The prolonged use of force, as you rightly pointed out, is destabilizing. And history has revealed many examples, whether in Vietnam, Afghanistan, or perhaps some might say Sri Lanka as well. But intervention with like-minded countries, and Article 51 of the UN Charter clearly permits the use of force as in collective self-defense. And I think you juxtapose that well with the role that the UNSC plays or sometimes does not play. And we have seen the United States also enter the first Gulf War, without the fullest support of the UN Security Council, acting, in self-defense with like-minded countries. So there is a range and a spectrum for that kind of interpretation. Now, I'm not sure if it was Bismarck who said this, but you were right in pointing out the importance of political objectives, being very important. I think Bismarck said that in the context of the same objectives prevailing at the start of a war and at the end of the war. And I suppose that applies to interventions as well. So thank you for that. Would you permit me to quickly read out a few questions? There are about 6 or 7 questions, perhaps 3 at a time. I begin with a few remarks that have been made by Commodore Mani Singh Mamik. And he wants to know if the quick Chinese withdrawal in Ladakh from Finger 8, etc., is going to lead to perhaps a hardened position when it comes to Deepsang, in light of some of the criticism that might have come out in Chinese media. And also, what do you think about Russia's ambivalent attitude in regard to courting Pakistan, as he puts it, in the context of change in the US administration, its stand on HR and Kashmir? And so are we left with only France as a reliable friend in case of any such requirements? Manju Seth wants to know more about the neighborhood first policy, which focuses on development and intervention, perhaps is also required, she thinks, to secure India's interests. And she cites, again, the immediate neighborhood. Would you like to take these? And one more, what do you think of a possible Indian intervention to liberate territories that we consider our own, which may be under alien occupation, specifically with regard to the sovereignty of India in Jammu and Kashmir? So this is the first lot that I'm sort of throwing at you. Over to you.
Thank you, Sujan. On the question of propaganda that you mentioned, I mean, our minister has written his new book called The India Way, where he repeatedly goes back to the Mahabharata, where propaganda was quite central. That included deception, whether it was the Dharmaraj himself saying Ashwatthama Kundira, that undermining the abilities, the adversary's political will, weakening his domestic formation, suborning his advisors. This is as old as statecraft. So I think what the digital domain is doing is to expand the scale and speed of such interventions by multiple means, I mean, including the non-state actors. For someone who's come from the left movement in JNU, I mean, I can say the non-state actors, the communist parties and the front organizations, I mean, they were far more powerful than anything we've seen today. Those who questioned the First World War in the West. The peace movements that challenged the bourgeois rhetoric on what was right, what was wrong. So I think there is a long history, and I can say Roman Catholic Church, once the Holy Roman Empire fell, is a non-governmental organization. So I think what was happened in 1648 was to assert the sovereignty of territorial states against a universal empire. And since then, the struggle has been, how do you balance the interests of securing yourself against foreign intervention, but at the same time, that having the capacity to cope with your interests, to deal with the threats to your security that materialize from shores beyond your borders. And I think that is the struggle. The struggle is not new. What is new today is the intensity and the scale of the challenge, because Indian discourse was in a mood of self-deception, not even to look at these issues, but justify ourselves in moral politic while you're consistently under pressure to become more realpolitik in dealing with the real world. Second, look, on China border, it will be pretentious of me to talk about the implications. We have the minister here in front of him to say what actually is going on or what its consequences. I mean, it would be utterly wrong for me to speak on an issue that is unfolded. But I would certainly recommend all of you to take a look at Army Chief's presentation at the VIF, Vivekananda Foundation, yesterday. I think he covered most of these kind of questions, what the agreement on disengagement means for the longer term. On Russia, I mean, look, there again, look, I think we got to recognize other countries have interests, even our friends and partners. That this idea that we must agree with everything our partners say, there's no way you can construct. Then we'll all be one country if we agree on everything. US and Japan, big trading partners. And as you know, you served in Japan, the constant fight on trade, not today, through decades. Germany, as some in America say, is a bigger threat to US trade policy than China is. And Germany enjoys American military support. So I think this notion that somehow we must be continuously in alignment with Russia on all issues, and I think it's a mistake. Just as we do things, but we understand our differences. One issue where I first saw KS in the 70s was this strong attack on both the US and the Soviet Union, because for him, both supported the NPT. The Soviet support to NPT was as strong as the American support. Did that mean we collapse our relationship with the Soviet Union? Do we make the NPT as a principal issue on which we relate to the Soviet Union? Of course not. So I think we should say, look, we have differences on Indo-Pacific, we have differences on Pakistan, but we must live with differences, just as our other countries don't agree with us on everything. And it is about minimizing those differences, going past them, that is statecraft, and not constantly worrying about we agree that everyone else is going to do exactly what we want them to do. That's not going to happen. On the neighborhood, I mean, see, I think, as we said, look, most of our interventions are in the neighborhood. And in the neighborhood, there is an interesting problem, which is there is a supply side. India is the largest country, is the natural intervener. But there is a demand side to it. That different groups within South Asia, in other countries, seek Indian intervention for their own purposes, domestic political purposes. And I think that's where India has to make a judgment in terms of how we use our force, or how deeply we get involved in the internal affairs of other countries. But at the same time, we've also learned that you can't completely stand apart from the conflicts of our neighbors, because subcontinent historically has been an integrated geopolitical space. And what happens in one part affects the other. And the trick over a period of time is to develop sufficient security cooperation between the neighbors to be able to deal with these problems in the least harmful way. On acquiring territories, if we could, we should have by now. I think we should be.
Sorry to interrupt. Not so much acquisition of territory, but as Dr. Rajiv Nayan wanted to know, what do you think about active intervention to regain what is rightfully ours?
I mean, I think it would be unwise on my part, to speak in front of the minister. I mean, I think this is IDSA should be raising it with all the important decision makers that you invite. My saying so makes no difference to what will happen in POK or other places. I think for now, at least, we should consolidate territories that are already under control. For example, the neglect of the Andaman and the Nicobar territories. For decades, we treated it like it didn't belong to us. It's only in the last few years we've seen a focus on building. I know that Ambassador Chinoy, you've written a paper that we pretended as if it didn't exist. So I think there's enough to do in what we control at this point, but I would leave regaining countries, territories to the minister who is willing to speak on it.
I know that you've been very, very generous, Raja, to talk to us in such a frank manner. The Honorable Minister has actually been extraordinarily generous with his presence here. So if I were to seek his further indulgence, there are a few more questions. And may I read them out to you? Because otherwise I run the risk of being accused of partiality to some. So very quickly, I will run through a few more questions. Dr. Vinod Kumar wants to know if it's really necessary for India to follow the same path as the great powers, particularly since many of them have burnt their fingers in engaging in external intervention. Ambassador Vishnu Prakash wants to know if India, in the context of the Quad, might be ready to join a coalition force, for instance, if conflict were to break out in the South China Sea. Does our enthusiasm for intervention extend to that? There is Ajinkya Jadhav wants to know if India should be building its expeditionary forces in the context of the IOR. Admiral Shekhar Sinha wants to know if India should be building bases for new challenges in the Indo-Pacific. Dr. Kalyan Raman says that there should be, according to the Powell Doctrine that was referred to, clear-cut political goals, exit strategy, and how feasible is it to expect such absolute predictability, by the adversary from start to finish. We have Santi Shri Pandit. Should we change our entire posture from being non-violent to being more Kshatriya, as she puts it? I thought that had all changed after the 1950s, in a sense, because after 62, we did move a little bit away from simply advocating tenets to being a little more, robust in terms of our outlook. The armed forces especially were given better resources, but not like what we're doing today. Much more is being done today. Again, Dr. Rajiv Nayan, whether India should intervene on behalf of its diaspora if required, as in militarily. And others want to know, why doesn't the Quad take action, etc.? There's just too many questions here. Admiral Muralidharan, I regret I can't read out everything here, but he's also saying something on the same lines as Admiral Sinha, asking if bases are in India's interest today. So these are some of the questions. Should we change our posture with regard to UN peacekeeping operations? Is a question that comes in from Mr. Yeshi Chodan. Should we send troops into Afghanistan? There's a cascade of questions here. Is it morally and practically advisable, as Dr. Prashant Singh says, to reclaim and emphasize a colonial kind of military approach of the Raj days? That's not Raja Mohan days, but Raj days of the past. Some might equate, the broad overview that you bring on empires past and present, and attribute the same kind of very deep thinking to you as well. So over to you, please. May I also suggest that what's left over and you really don't want to address, this is really a kind of starter course for the Honorable Minister to comment on in his vote of thanks. We both know that. So Raja, over to you.
Thanks, Sujan. I think the depth and variation of questions, I think I would say here is an agenda for IDSA to work on in the days ahead, that there are no easy answers for these questions. But this is exactly what I said the think tanks should be working on. I mean, this doesn't need to be a kind of huge public thing. This is the kind of work we ought to be doing as a way of the kind of issues that come up in dealing with use of force. And I think that intellectual exercise itself will be hugely beneficial. Following other powers, look, there was a time when India and China used to say, look, we are different. We're going to start a new world. We won't be like the other powers. Chinese were saying this even 10 years ago. But they're doing exactly what the other powers did. So if you're a realist in international affairs, you would say, look, what you say depends on where you stand. That if you're a great power, the imperatives of great power demand certain approaches which a weak state, which is trying to prevent others from intervention, is using a certain types of argument. So I think it is not a question of following the other powers, that there are different ways of approaching it. How do you deal with the threats that come to you? Is it simply a question of following others? It's not a question of following others. As a political scientist, you could say, look, there are some structural features. Most great powers do intervene. They take a larger role in security. But how each of those great powers do this, that depends on the specific conditions in each country. Coalition and Quad, look, I think we are barely at the beginning of a debate. So the governments are barely talking about it. And I think there again, it is for us to approach those questions and say, what does it mean? How far? How? And there's enough body of evidence from what happened with other countries to be able to deal with it. Expeditionary forces, there was a time when, I mean, it was a bad word, but today we're increasingly using our forces. For example, somebody asked about diaspora. If something happens to some nurses deep inside Iraq, the Kerala chief minister is on the phone to Dr. Jaishankar saying, what the hell are you doing about it? This is not the 1950s and 60s where we said, you went out, you went on your own risk, God will take care of you. But today in India, that is strong, is saying, look, if any Indian with an Indian passport gets affected somewhere, it is India's moral duty to use force, whatever means it has, to be able to get them back. That's already the practice. Going back to 1990, which was the first case of actually evacuating people from Kuwait, to much more frequent, because the size of Indian diaspora has dramatically increased. And the commitment, I think, a new commitment, I would say, in Delhi to protect the diaspora is a big new development. And I think there's enough there to even to analyze those. Somebody has made a film on the 1990 evacuation, but I think so much more has happened to actually look at these evacuation operations. As I said, the IDSA report by Anant Mukherjee and others actually touches upon evacuation operations. And in fact, our Chinese friends have actually done similar number of operations, and they're doing it even more frequently and more intensively. On the basis question, so the Chinese used to say, nobody should have foreign bases, Indian Ocean will be happy if there are no bases. That was our rhetoric in the 70s. I grew up with that. Today, the Chinese have a base in the Indian Ocean. In Djibouti, probably, there's something going on in Gwadar, we really don't know. There is a Chinese workshop in Karachi, which does a lot of things. Chinese frigates are being assembled in Karachi. So this idea that Chinese won't project power is an illusion. The Chinese can't simply fax their navy to the Indian Ocean. If they want to operate in the Indian Ocean, they need to create facilities, bases, friendly powers, and special access arrangements. So that is, I mean, I think India should be doing the same. That's my view, that it is in the inherent nature of things that if India wants to secure its interest in the Indian Ocean or broadly the Indo-Pacific, it needs to develop tools and techniques which give it access, which makes it easier for it to operate. And I think that's again inherent in the structure itself. But again, I think we're not debating that sufficiently in our own self. On nonviolence and the caste system, we don't have to get into that. As I said, from day one, India was confronted with the question of violence. While we address those issues in our own way, the rhetoric, the discourse, the academic analysis continued to pretend as if India is involved in moral politics. That's what I'm saying. Our job as analysts, those of us who are outside the government, is to look at the record and to look at the possibilities. So it is not a question of one or the other, because in the end, it is about costs, it's about effectiveness, it's about feasibility. So it's again a question of judgment and statecraft, not that you have, one theory to fit all. That there's a case you might intervene, there's another case you might not intervene, because it's going to be too complicated or there's not enough domestic support. I think it is working on this metrics of the judgments of what we can guide the policymakers of how to make these judgments is the little thing we can do, and not merely taking a position, good or bad, either this or that. Afghan troops, I think we had this debate in Iraq intervention. That was in 2003, Vajpayee government debated very closely the question of India sending troops to Iraq. In the event, Vajpayee decided not to. I know that for a fact, there is a debate on Afghanistan. But it's again, I would say it's up to IDSA to actually debate this in a closed door, in whatever form. What are the costs and benefits? How do you do force protection if you put troops in Afghanistan? What is the way in which you're going to take them out in case there is a problem? These issues, I think these are normal military strategy issues that we don't debate enough, I think, at the level, our level. Look, I think it's easy to dismiss things as a colonial thing. As I said, Chinese used to use this rhetoric very intensively. But if something happens to copper production in Zambia, it affects the Chinese interests. If there is a coup in, I don't want to name a small island country, shall we say, that affects India's interests in that part of the world. So this notion that, either you are colonial or you say, look, Mr. Secretary General, that means the P5 is going to help you resolve the problems. And P5 will play its own game. We've seen that in Kashmir. So for the question is not to be tied down this fear of colonialism or other factors, but here are India's interests have changed. Can you define that? Diaspora, students outside, interdependence today, your 60% of your GDP is coming from imports and exports. How do you protect those? If you go into those issues and say, this is the best possible means, these are the dangers, that is the template we need to work. And that was my burden of my argument, that IDSA and other think tanks in Delhi must get down to this level of examination and not this moralizing moral tone that we've used to subsume difficult questions about the use of force and intervention in the past. So I will stop there, Sujan.
Thank you very much, Raja. And I'm sure everybody who's listening would agree that you have very successfully shone the light on a number of complex issues. And if only we had Mr. K Subrahmanyam today with us, he would have been immensely proud of not only the IDSA as an institution that he had nurtured over the years, but especially the kind of relevance to strategic thinking that your own writings and utterances and pronouncements bring. This, ladies and gentlemen, friends, brings us to the very end, but to the most important part of our event today, and that is also to get the Honorable Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, to deliver the vote of thanks. And he, in a sense, can also perhaps tell us what Mr. K. Subrahmanyam might have said about some of these issues, having grown up in an atmosphere where such discussions must have been the, fare at the dinner table in conversations, daily conversations in that household. There is no one better to reflect on the totality of this discussion than Dr. S. Jaishankar. I'm very grateful to him. And I hand over the floor to you, sir, to deliver what we would euphemistically call the vote of thanks. But as you all know, it is going to be much more substantive than that. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sujan, and thank you, Raj. First of all, I want to say that I'm here today as a representative of the Subrahmanyam family, not as an External Affairs Minister. And this is a vote of thanks. So don't hold your breath there. But let me really begin, first of all, by saying that, Sujan, we couldn't have had a better person to deliver the lecture than Raja Mohan, because in many ways, I say this to a current director of IDSA about a previous director of IDSA. Raja Mohan was my father's successor in IDSA who never was. Okay. It was no secret among us, certainly in the family, that he was very keen that at some point of time he succeed him in IDSA. It didn't happen, many good things don't happen. But I can say this, that certainly, we belong to the same generation, we studied together. Certainly in the next generation, he was a person my father saw very much as the person with the greatest potential. And I really think over the years, Raj has certainly lived up to it. Having said that, let me also, at the risk of embarrassing you, Sujan, compliment you. But in all honesty, I think I should, because, having seen IDSA built up, And I first, we all first started going there when we were in school. These were the days when you kind of occasionally hang around your father's office, hitch a sort of ride back. It happened much more to us, of course, when we went to college, because it cut the bus time from Delhi University to Netaji Nagar by half. But there was a pleasure in hanging around Sapru House those days, and having seen IDSA come up, I can tell you today, he would be really pleased to see where you've taken it today, how you are sort of keeping that up, and it's not just in the quality of analysis. I think one of the points on which he used to pride himself was the fact that the government used to take him seriously, and he had a very interesting relationship, and therefore IDSA had an interesting relationship with the government also. Raj has referred to it in a way at the beginning of his remarks. So I think it would only be fair for me to acknowledge it. So let me say something about the subject. I will use the word KS, though it's a bit awkward to talk about your father using initials like that. We have 4 children. We were 3 sons and a daughter. In a way, I was the only son who went into the same business. The others have all done very well, but they were in different lines of businesses. And I went into the business not by joining the government, that came later, but actually by first leaving the IIT to go across the street and join JNU. So I abandoned what may have been a good career in chemistry for what has not been a bad career in international relations. And in a way, what you said was right. I mean, we got free and unconscious education at home. But I can also tell you, it was also something which weighed on you a bit. I mean, you were always, in many ways, compared with him. People expected you to share those views, or sort of live up to his views, his standards, whatever you may call it. So there was a plus and a minus. Of course, the plus outweighed the minus, but it wasn't exactly, as sort of roses all the way. Now, if I were to talk about him as a person, in today's parlance, he would be described as an influencer. He was an influencer because he shaped thinking. He could affect, an audience way beyond those immediately listening to him. And as we grew up, actually, it came as a bit of a surprise to us that, many people knew him. He was quote unquote famous. Some of it was the newspaper, some of it was the television. And I still remember my children, my elder children, once they were with him in the airport. And they said there was a UN peacekeeping contingent, Blue Berets, exiting. And a bunch of them came up to my father. And I think it was my daughter. We had come out of Sri Lanka, okay? So there was a lot of army in our lives at that point of time. So for her, it was more important. Army recognized him. Said, just imagine, he's famous enough to be known to the army. So he was an influencer in many ways, but he was an influencer because, as Raj has brought out, he was a hard realist who was working in a semi-idealist environment and trying to introduce correctives into the situation, which is what you argue is not what you always do. What you suggest is not always a suggestion for yourself. So, I mean, there are many wrinkles there, complexities there. Now, he was also, obviously, if you're an influencer, those days we'd have used the term, he was a debater. We don't use that term anymore. And the fact was, he was a very visceral debater. Okay. I mean, there was an episode where he had an argument with Henry Kissinger when he came here in 1971. I think Gary Bass's book captures that somewhat. But as Raj and I would recall, we used to see it in JNU, okay, where therefore my endeavor was not to be in the front row because sometimes it could get pretty rough, you know. I mean, I remember once he was being at, this guns and butter issue which you spoke about, Sujan. I had one of my own professors who said that the country was wasting money. It shouldn't be having a navy at all. I mean, we just had questions whether we should be having bases. So those days, people even questioned whether we should be having a navy. And the response which my father gave was, well, there are two sets of people who don't want a navy, the Pakistanis and the smugglers. Now, I don't know on whose behalf you're talking. Now, you can imagine, that's not exactly the time you made eye contact with that particular professor. So there would be, this was in many ways, I would say, the 60s, I'm capturing the 60s and 70s in a way. But like all of us, I hope, he mellowed with time. I think, so in a way, I would say there were less mission-oriented sort of strong advocacy for him. It got broader and broader. But I would say this, I mean, obviously I'm a little biased, but one fact which I saw even at home, even when, I was in my teens, he was a democratic person. That for him, if you had an interesting viewpoint, an interesting argument, it didn't matter how old you were or what you were. I mean, he was always willing to have a good debate democratically with anybody. Now, having said that, what were the personal characteristics which I think helped him to do what he did? Probably the one I would identify most was his constant willingness to challenge dogma. He actually had a book, if my memory serves me right, called Shedding Shibboleths. So this idea that, it will be because it was, and, how can we this, he used to sort of get very angry with what he would call textualism, and particularly much later when, we were in the Indo-US nuclear deal time, and there would be various people whom he knew well, who would kind of say, well, this is a departure from that word, and maybe the deal is not so good because of that. I think it used to understandably sort of annoy him, because he would feel that they were losing the woods, not even for the trees, but sometimes for the leaves, and sometimes for the dead leaves. In fact, I remember once in IIC, during that period, he encountered Venkateshwaran, AP Venkateshwaran, who was a very good friend of his, okay? And Sujan, you worked with Venkat, all of us. So, Venkat was Venkat, okay? So Venkat kind of accosted him in the dining room and said, hey, Subbu, what happened to you? You used to be such an anti-American fellow, and here you are advocating, sort of all these deals with the Americans. And of course, my father gave him they were very close, so could give him an equally blunt retort saying, wake up, Venkat, and sort of smell the coffee, the world has changed. So this constant need to update, revise, today what we would call refresh, I think this was something which was important for him. The issues, of course, I think between the two of you, you have referred to a lot of them. I think guns and butter was actually his original issue, and I'm so glad, Sujan, that you brought it out, because his first books were actually, I think his first book was a book called Defense and Development on that particular issue. So, I mean, it got overtaken much later by his nuclear advocacy. The nuclear one, of course, the nuclear cause was something which was dear to him, and he was a very, very strong advocate. Then Bangladesh came along, and I think that was really where sort of, I would say, he hit his peak. Also, because that's when he got much more deeply into the world of politics. He used to work with Chandrasekhar and that group. He became a very close friend of Krishnakant as a result. He worked with the JP. JP was given the responsibility by Mrs. Gandhi to take that campaign international. But when I look at all of that, I'm reminded of something which my younger brothers said when my father passed away, which was he was a person very deeply shaped by his experiences of 62, 65, and 71. And I would add to that 99, but that came much later. I think that wouldn't be shaping so much as by the time he was a well-formed person. I also, again, because Raj touched on it, want to say this, this whole thing, you are what you may call the consistency debate. You are advocating something, but you will not do it at home. No, yeah, okay, it's a fine debating point, but the reality is this is not inconsistency. I think there is a duality in life that all powers, I mean, it's in the nature of international relations that countries have a certain view of, you cannot mix up your offensive principles with your defensive principles. Anybody who suggests that, frankly, doesn't understand the basics of international relations. Now, in all of this, I think if I were to pick a single thread in his professional life, it would be the thoughts and deliberations on the use of force. And again, I'm so glad that Raj picked that as the theme for today's lecture, because the preparation for the use of force, the constraints on the use of force, the opportunity for the use of force, the legitimacy of the use of force. Again, we use the word narrative today, shaping the narrative, creating the narrative. Those days, I think people would have used the word legitimacy. And much later, and I think in a way, I can say this when I was in Sri Lanka, I think he also started reflecting more on the prolonged use of force. Because when we went into Sri Lanka, Sundarji was one of his closest friends. And I would come back from Sri Lanka, not complaining, but vocalizing what I felt was not going right. And then this whole, I think there was a realization that a prolonged use of force abroad has a cost and a sustainability issue. Now, if I were to shift and talk a little bit about the use of force, I mean, clearly the use of force of my father's era was a time when a lot of it was meant for territorial defense. It was about defending and protecting the country. Then, as we saw, I mean, in a sense, Bangladesh was extrapolation of it, but it started shifting to influencing and shaping. You could see that in the, I would say, 70s, 80s, which really meant you were going abroad. So use of force is now no longer completely defensive. There is a near abroad sort of connotation to it. And I think today we have come to a third level. It is the level of common good. That when people say India is a rising power, you're taking on more responsibility. So what are you bringing to the table? I think that ability, the ability to project power, to maintain power, if occasion demands, to apply power for common good. Now, that doesn't, don't take it necessarily in a lethal sense. To me, an HADR operation abroad is an application of power abroad for common good, working with others, even developing maritime domain awareness is the preparation for the application of power for common good abroad. So today, I think when you look at the use of force debate, the old debates are still there. I think this, defending and protecting our country will always be our paramount duty and focus. The influencing and shaping will be increasingly there. But now we have gone to that new level, I would argue, especially, as Raj pointed out, you had Prime Minister articulating the Sagar outlook, the fact that you have an integrated ocean strategy, and there are other ways today by which you are making your presence and capability felt in the world. Now, like everybody else, I think KS2 evolved with the times. In JNU, in political science, which is what I started studying first, there was this big debate about the young Marx and the older Marx. Okay, so if I were to apply that template to him, which was, I think, over a period of time, he was clearly tempered by experience, clearly very much more, in a sense, educated by his understanding and dealing with politics. And a lot of that, I think, also showed in a interest which he developed of power beyond the military dimension. So at one level, he got much more interested in understanding and exploiting the contradictions of the world. That was always there because he was always interested in strategy. But in that sense, it brought him closer to my immediate business, as a diplomat. But the one which actually, I would say, surprised, well, I wouldn't say surprised me, but I was quite interested by that evolution, the direction of the evolution, was he got more and more interested in the knowledge economy, in, today, I use today's words, supply chains, knowledge economy, dependency, how do you, leveraging trade, economics. And in fact, I think in his last years, he actually headed a task force for the government. My recollection, I don't remember all the members, but I know Tarun Das was in it. I think Uday Bhaskar was also in it. So he got much more into the non-orthodox power, if you would. And of course, in a way, the Kargil committee report for me was back to governance. That between the Kargil committee and that whole NSAB convenership period, that was him now applying knowledge back in the service of the government. And so it sort of brought him far more deeply into he was always connected to the policy making world, but now very much more so. And this was particularly that period when Brijesh Mishra was the NSA. So let me just, I know it's a long vote of thanks, but let me just conclude with two observations. I think it would interest a lot of people to know that literally the last thing which he was writing, I mean, it was on his computer when he passed away, was a piece called Grand Strategy for the first half of the 21st century. I think my son Dhruva has a copy of it. I don't know if he ever got to polish it up and get it out. But certainly, I think when you look at the things we do today, the HADR, even what Raj spoke about, the diaspora as a sort of statement of influence, even initiatives like Solar Alliance, etc. So the idea, what does India do to prepare itself for the big jump? That occupied his last years very much. That made him grow beyond the more military, narrowly strategic issues. And I would say, as a person, he was always a very patriotic person, but he was also, it came from within. So for him, unlike that famous remark in Godfather, it may have been business, but it was always personal. So with those words, maybe I should hand the floor back to you.
Thank you very much, sir, for what you call the vote of thanks, but what I would call a very magisterial walk through a number of very complex issues, and also for actually walking us through the mind of Shri K Subrahmanyam, which was unparalleled in terms of the manner in which he could, in a very multi-layered way, look at all these difficult issues. It is a fact that you and Dr. C. Raja Mohan were in the front row of the show, but then others like me were also in the auditorium, perhaps at the back. And I remember that my own association with Mr. K. Subrahmanyam started at the moment I returned from China in the end of 1987. And I also greatly benefited every time I had an opportunity to either read what he had written or to listen to him speak at numerous events and seminars. The both of you actually have taken that great legacy forward, if I may use that term, albeit from different points and space in his life. Both of you, the keynote speaker and you, have a certain shared past in that sense and are today among the very effective exponents of our traditional way of looking at strategic issues, that is Sam, Dan, Danda, and Bhed. And you've taken this to new heights in a very dexterous and also, if I may say, subtle manner. And Mr. K Subrahmanyam's ability to relate to ideas more than age or to relate to new thinking more than to shibboleths, which had to be, a kind of slough at the end of the day to be shed, is something that is enduring in what you say and frequently in what I see in the utterances and writings of Mr. Raja Mohan as well. So thank you for this immensely interesting insider view, if we can call that, both from Dr. Raja Mohan and from you. We have actually, we are leaving this webinar with a kind of Weltanschauung that might have been that of Shri K Subrahmanyam today, worry with us today. Lamentably, he's not with us today. He was a person that was deeply shaped by events, as you put it, but I should also add that he was also a person who deeply shaped events. So that is something that we all bear in mind. I really hope to make sure that we do not do this episodically, that we should actually make use of this forum that we have here to do this on an annual basis. And perhaps this also leaves us with a lot of work in the intervening period to look at the grand strategy for the 21st century that he was working on. I would say that his third eye had opened up even more in his last few years. And we hope to have a sneak sort of peek into what he might have said in that piece of work, which is still awaiting publication. But this truly leaves us with a lot of work, new ideas on which I hope the IDSA will sort of examine issues and analyze things further. With this, I would like to bring this very interesting event to an end. And it only remains for me to once again very profoundly thank you, Dr. S. Jaishankar, the Honorable Minister, as well as Dr. C. Raja Mohan, who have delighted us with their knowledge and experience today. And that is a befitting tribute to Shri K. Subrahmanyam. I thank you all very much. A very good evening and wish you all good health as well. Thank you. Namaste.